kind of nonplussed here. What do you say? I didn't know that it was that good. I would, in some ways, rather be talking about Timothy than talking about textual criticism. I appreciate the words concerning that series. I have done some work on it, and other matters have claimed my attention for a while, but I haven't forgotten the project. I still intend to do it. It's a series of expository sermons on Timothy and Titus, particularly from the standpoint of the significance for the living of the Christian life and the strengthening of the church. The idea I have in mind is godliness with contentment, and we'll see, Lord willing, how that develops. But I do appreciate the invitation to be here and those kind words. I've looked over the subjects, and I feel a great deal as I felt 2 weeks ago last Sunday night. Brother Claiborne and I and some others were flying from Jackson to Columbia, South Carolina. We were about 2,500 to 3,000 feet, and it was a very fine evening, very calm and peaceful until we hit the Georgia line. And then what they call turbulence came with a capital T. And I got to thinking, I can't fly a plane, I'm in the back seat. Claiborne's the only pilot we have. What would happen if we hit a storm? Claiborne had a heart attack and both his wings came off. Well, when you set out to discuss difficult text of the New Testament, that's bad enough. But then explained, that takes the wings off of it. I think it'll be fun. I'm going to leave as quickly as I can. I will hear about it, though, by the time we get home. I appreciate being here and always look forward to seeing you and having a part in various brotherhood activities. The subject of difficult matters is before us. There are others who have spoken on difficult topics. Some have talked about the tools that have to do with the studying of difficult passages. Others have looked at the context and the content of different verses. And I feel sure that you have been encouraged by the reading of the various speeches and listening to the various speakers. The topic that I am to discuss is also a difficult one, and we want to approach it as best we can with the awareness of the inherent difficulty, but at the same time the concern that we will at least give information and perspective from which to pursue the difficulties. As the outline shows in the book, we'll be talking about two matters. First, some of the problem areas, and then some passages where these problem matters are applied. First, concerning areas of problem. When you talk about any kind of criticism with reference to the Bible, it has a sound to it that I don't like and I don't think most brethren like. I do not want to be in the position of criticizing the Bible in the sense that the word is usually understood. When we talk about criticizing something, we talk about being against it, trying to say it's wrong. Well, who in his right mind would want to say that the Bible is wrong? That way lies atheism. There is a sense of the word criticism that is not so harmful and erroneous. That has to do with a careful and critical analysis of relevant facts on a particular subject. That is the sense in which we are using the term textual criticism. And yet to some people, this very act itself seems an irreverent handling of the Word of God. We sometimes forget that in the respecting of the text of the Bible, we still are to try to obtain the exact truth of God on every subject. And when we turn to study the Bible, we must pay attention not only to the context, but we must look carefully at the given word in a particular verse and a verse in a chapter and so on. That means then that we are looking at the result of a process that maybe was completed many years ago. And yet the results of that process are before us. We are asked implicitly by those who completed the process previously to accept the result of their work. Well, from time to time, we find ourselves needing to look again at the conclusions of those who have gone before, weigh and evaluate why they decided as they did, raise the question of whether they have analyzed all that needed to be thought about, whether they had all of the information that needed to be considered, and so on. And when you begin doing that, you are really attempting to find the exact truth on a point. It is in that sense of criticism, then, that we are proceeding in our discussion. There is no essential doctrine of the New Testament that is jeopardized or sacrificed by what is known as textual criticism. To me, that is a very comforting thought. God, in His providence, saw to it that His Word has been preserved. And the result of that preservation lies before us in the legitimate results of textual criticism and biblical translation. Those teachings of God about how to know Him, how to become Christians, how to worship, how to live, how indeed to go to heaven, are not up for discussion in any matter of textual critical concern. But the very fact that we are discussing such an area may cause some to be a little bit concerned about a person's respect for the Bible or even his willingness to listen to what God said. I trust the clarification is adequate. But a second area of problem. I believe that there is a resistance to the idea that the original text is primary. Now, that can be said with a sense of arrogance and so-and-so knows it all and somebody is smart and somebody else is not smart. That's not the thing we're talking about here. We ought to always have a reverence for God and for His Word, and we ought to have the proper kind of love and respect for one another. And we ought not to treat one another in any way that is improper or unkind. We ought then, in discussing the matter of the primacy of the Greek and Hebrew text, to realize what we are discussing. I believe that each of us can and should, and in fact does, respect the reliable translations that are among us. I have been preaching from, and Lord willing plan to continue preaching from, the King James Version until I die. I have consulted many translations over the years, and I've spent some time in the Greek and Hebrew as occasion arose. We ought to respect the reliable translations, but we ought also to realize that behind the very best of them, there is always the issue of which verse, which word, which letter is the true one. If you will take the time to lay the King James and American Standard Versions down side by side and read each verse from Matthew through Revelation, you will find a number of places where there is variation, not only in terms of rendering, but also in terms of content. And that immediately raises some questions that have to be answered in terms of technical criticism. That, of course, is what we are considering here. Behind every English translation of merit, there always lies the question of which text is being used by the translator, which is being incorporated. It is an interesting fact that in the work of Scrivener, in the parallel Greek-English Testament, he points out that the King James translators used the 1598 version or edition of Erasmus' text, and then used at least 8 or 9 other sources. And in the use of these sources, they varied from the 1598 Textus Receptus in some 90 to 93 instances. Now, I've only been able to count some 60 of them, but he maintains that he's found upwards of 90. But be that as it may, it illustrates the point that we are here considering. Now, in a disputed passage, either as to its content or its meaning, what becomes the primary, ultimate judge? Well, the answer I would give, and I trust that you would give, is that ultimately the Greek and Hebrew is primary over the English translation. Now, that isn't to disparage the English, but it is to, if you please, point us in the proper direction. A third problem area that arises is the abundance of information. Now, it's not the same thing in textual criticism as it is in the balancing of our budget, individually or nationally. We have more to work with than we want to work with in textual criticism. I frequently have less to work with than my wife wants to work with. And that may be your problem as well. I'm a long way from home, and I can say that, but don't send any tapes over there. That means then that sometimes we are working with a tremendous amount of material. For example, there are some 5,000 manuscripts containing the New Testament in part and in largely all of it, varying with each manuscript. Some having a few verses here or there, some having all of the New Testament with an occasional verse or word or section omitted. Now, that's a staggering number of works to think about. And these, in turn, are given any number of variations. But you add the versions. In the United Bible Society text, there are some 79 versions that are mentioned as having been consulted. These are versions that date from, the late 2nd to the early 3rd century and onward. Now, these versions have to do with a text that lay behind them. And when you begin to look at the technical aspects of this word or this verse or this section or whatever, those who know both languages are able, by very careful study, to conclude that this particular word lay behind this particular translation. But now you've added 5,000 and you've added 29, but it gets worse. Then you turn to the various writers. In just the United Bible Society text, there is a note having to do with 212 of these writers who were consulted. And these writers quoted passages. Sometimes they quoted large sections, sometimes words, sometimes they offered a commentary, sometimes a discussion of a technical point. Now, these men, over a period of several centuries, wrote various discussions of biblical words and passages and chapters. Well, you get into the technicality now. Which is the exact reading? What is the exact word here? Well, the problem gets to be pretty difficult. You have to assemble the evidence, and that takes quite a bit of time, just to get the information together in one place. In fact, it hasn't been done completely. There are copies, photocopies, and so on. But after you've assembled it, you still must arrange it with reference to a verse by verse, word by word, and in some instances, letter by letter. In 1 Timothy 3:15, or rather 16, for example, are you concerned with theos or hos or ha? Now, technically, when you get into it, There are possibilities that would suggest that it could be a theta sigma, an omicron sigma with a rough breathing, or an omicron with a rough breathing but not a sigma. Now you get all of that information together, and it begins to be a rather difficult thing just to arrange it on these two letters. Just these two letters. Is it theta sigma, omicron sigma, or omicron? Well, wait a minute. I hadn't thought about that. Wing's about to fall off here. After you have assembled it, you then must assess the relative importance. What if you have 5 manuscripts dating from the 3rd or 4th century, and 2 of them have the reading, but 3 of them don't on this word? And then on the next word, it changes. You have 3 and 2, or 1 and 4, or 4 and 1, or 2 and 3. And word by word by word by word by word you go. And all of this now is there. Well, now let's look at the versions for a moment. And all of those come out, and all of the quotations come out. And the difficulty begins to be more than can be mastered over less than 2 cups of coffee. We then must assess the weight of the relative evidence. Are the manuscripts stronger than the versions? Are the versions stronger than the quotations? Well, here you see you're in the area not of finding material. You've got more material than you can readily understand. But how do you thread your way through? Well, once you have set out to decide, you try to decide which reading and why. It's interesting that in Metzger's commentary, he gives 1,400 occurrences that everybody said are difficult. But then he said, just to make it more interesting, I'm adding 600 more that I've thrown in on my own. That's 2,000. And he takes them up from Matthew 1 to Revelation chapter 22. Now, you begin to see that here is a very difficult problem. Now, I don't want us to become unduly alarmed, but it's not something that readily admits of being discussed without very careful and patient attention to technical matters. One more that I mentioned, and that is the assessment of how do you go at this thing. You not only have variation in the manuscripts, the versions, the quotations, the lectionaries, or whatever, but in the last 5 to 10 years, there has been a tremendous amount of discussion about how you even go at approaching the evidence. Now, that's an interesting thing that those who are acquainted with the journals and technical matters are, I think, somewhat aware of, but maybe the average person has not spent much time in it. For example, the Textus Receptus that lies behind the King James Version dates from about 1516 and pretty well held a field for a great number of years until the 1830s and 40s when it began to be disputed. But after about 1881 or so, the work of Westcott and Hort became the standard generally of what was and what was not the New Testament text. But it's interesting that in the last 25 years, there have been a series of evaluations of the work of Westcott and Hort. You might want to obtain the work by Ernest Caldwell, Studies in Methodology, in 1969, in which he discusses some limitations, as he sees them, of the Westcott-Hort approach in the genealogical discussion of manuscripts, and also a very interesting chapter on Hort being revived and brought up to date. It gets very technical, and I understand that this is not the Reader's Digest that we're talking about, but if you become interested in this area, you must plunge into some of these books at least. In the last few years, among conservative people, there's been an interesting book by a man named Pickering on the identity of the New Testament text. Now, Pickering takes issue very strongly with Westcott and Hort. He has had a response to his work in some measure by a man named Carson in the King James Version debate, 1979. But the point of it is that it's now in a very fluid condition. Not so much what are the readings, but how do you go at trying to understand and assess the evidence from the versions to the quotations to the manuscripts. What are the families? What are the historical links? Do you have to do with what's called the Byzantine or the majority text or the traditional text, and on and on and on? Well, after a while, your head begins to hurt, and that makes it difficult. Now, all of that is a part, and I've just kind of touched the hem of the garment here, a part of this whole matter. If you want to try your hand at it, turn to the Nestle text on any given New Testament passage and notice what is called the critical apparatus. Now, that's the footnotes and a little kind of shorthand, hieroglyphics, whatever. Once you understand it, it says things to you. What it says sometimes will again make your eyes hurt. But this is the analysis of the evidence on which the readings in the Nestle text came about. And the UBS does the same thing. Now, the result of all this, it's not easy then to answer what is the text in a disputed passage. We don't like to maybe say that as loud as some folks do, but facts are facts. And when all of the, shall we say, public relations matters have been laid aside, the facts in the case must be looked at. And they must be looked at carefully and patiently, and may I add the word reverently. But it's not an easy matter. Most of us are not familiar with these technicalities, and those who have, let us say, a speaking acquaintance with them may lack some of the grasp, some of the background, some of the years of diligent labor that are necessary to really make decisions in these areas. We need then to be aware of this. We need to acquaint ourselves with some of these matters, at least in a general way. And then, as we have opportunity, try to develop an ability to discuss these things with a measure of competence. Now to the passages in the moments that remain. The three that have been selected are well known to us, and I want to say a few words about each as time permits. The passage in Mark 16:9 through 20 has been, from our standpoint, a battleground in many ways. Here, many debates on the subject of faith and baptism and the relation between the two have been conducted. We're familiar with the Hardeman Bogart and the Warren Ballard, and you begin to name them, and we'll surely leave off a half a dozen. But again and again, the question arises whether this is a part of the Bible. And then, of course, we've had a discussion in recent years about tongue speaking and matters of miraculous nature. How many of us have wanted, whether we ever got to do it or not, to challenge Oral Roberts and our own, I use that in quotes, Pat Boone about that poison business. They don't want any of that poison. They take the tongues, but not the snakes and the poison. But anyway, that's not Scripture for them. But now the question arises, are these verses in the Bible? Should they be? Well, look at some of the facts. The verses are missing from some rather significant sources. Whatever your decision is, the facts are there, and you can go to the British Museum or to Tübingen or various places, and you can look at the materials for yourself. And if you know just enough to read the verses, you can see that the verses are not there or are there. Now, that's just a fact. Now, where are they missing? Well, they're missing from the manuscript Sinaiticus, from Vaticanus, from many of the Old Latin, the Syriac, the Armenian versions. They are missing from Eusebius, the great church historian, from Jerome, one of the critics and interpreters in the period 400, 420, along in there. They're missing, they said, from the copies that they knew. Now, that's pretty strong evidence. Here are very, very competent sources that have to be considered. You don't just say, well, ta-ta, this is silly. Well, I guess you could say that, but you can't say it responsibly. There's a difference between saying something and saying it responsibly. And you can't just wave that aside and say, well, that doesn't impress me a bit. Well, it may not impress you a bit, but the problem may be that your impressor's out of whack. You need to get your impressor worked on. And this is an impressive array of evidence. But there's some evidence for it. And this is where, as Shakespeare would say, the rub lies. You'll find it in Alexandrinus from the 5th century, in Ephraim, in Beza. Irenaeus has a reference to it in his dates are 210 or so when he died. Tatian has a reference to it in his Diatessaron, a kind of harmony of the Gospels, in the 2nd century. The most ancient versions have it, the uncials, the cursives, the lectionaries. Now, the evidence is strong both ways. Both ways. You know what President Eisenhower said about economists, I understand? He said, I wish I could get a one-handed economist. Because he said, every time I go to these fellows, one of them says, on the one hand and on the other hand. Well, I want a one-handed economist. Well, we want a one-handed textual critic, but they don't grow them anymore. There's evidence on one side and on the other. To my way of thinking, as I've indicated in the book itself, there's a strong discussion in the work of Scrivener and Salmon with reference to some indications that the two older manuscripts, Aleph and Vaticanus, are not decisive. I think the probability is that the scribe of Aleph and Vaticanus knew that the material in Mark 16:9-20 was before him. And he worked with a number of letters and the way he put these letters together in these two manuscripts to cover up a blank. Now, I would not say that this was an Aleph gate or a Sinai gate, but there was some handling of the number of lines on the page and the number of letters, the stichoi, in the different sentences that indicate, to many minds at least, that the copyist was aware of some material that should have been in, but for some reason it was not. And he knew that the reader would immediately detect the blank at the end of the page, and so he made his letters larger and filled in the blank accordingly. Salmon has an interesting work on that. I would suggest that the quote in the book having to do with the words of McGarvey pretty well give what I think is the conclusion of the matter. A good index of this material is in the book by Brother Warren, the Warren-Ballard debate. He has an excellent chart and diagram on the matter. Let's turn to the next in the few moments remaining now. In Acts 8:37, here again we are very close to some matters that are very precious to us. The truth of the confession of faith is so dear to our hearts, and rightly so. For with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. And I'd rather put my hand in the fire than to do anything to discourage that. When the world is being lost, we do not want to be in the business of discouraging people or seeming to discourage them from making a confession of faith in Christ as the Son of God. But again, we're back to that problem of the two-handed economist. What are the facts in the case? Well, when you look at the facts in the case, this quotation in Acts chapter 8, verse 37 is not in some of the strongest sources. Just not there. It is not in Papyrus 45, Papyrus 74. It is not in Sinaiticus. It is not in Alexandrinus. It is not in Vaticanus. It is not in Ephraim. It is not in the Latin, the Syriac, and the Coptic versions generally. Now that's strong evidence And it's hard to say, well, now, it just doesn't make any sense to me. I just believe that so-and-so. Well, again, we're back to this matter of being informed. In the article in the book, you notice the quotation from Brother Brent's and also Brother Lipscomb, which I think is a very strong way of looking at it. And I tried to include there, and did include, the quotation from Bruce. He rejects the verse. And yet when he comes down to wrestle with the very problem that he raised for himself, he says, no doubt he did so satisfactorily himself. And I think implicitly he lets the cat out of the bag. And this is the strength of the material from Brent's and from Brother Lipscomb, but you'll see it there in the book. The closing passage is 1 John 5 and verse 7. The facts are easily found. It is absent from every known Greek manuscript except 4. And the 4 wherein it is found date from the 11th to the 16th century. 2 of these, as I recall, are marginal notes in those manuscripts. It is not quoted in what are called the Greek, quote, fathers. It first appears, so far as we're able to tell, in 1215 in a Greek version of the decrees of the Catholic Lateran Council. It is not in the Syriac, in the Coptic, and in most of the other ancient versions. It is not found in the oldest of the Latin versions, but in some of the more recent ones it is found. Apparently it was placed in the text by Erasmus on the basis of a rather unwise promise that he had made. Brother Guy Woods, I think, has pretty well summed up the case as I believe it is. I do not believe that there is adequate evidence for the inclusion of 1 John 5 and verse 7 as a part of the original text of the Scriptures. Now, 2 or 3 words in conclusion. First, the work of the textual critic is a technical and extensive one. It does not attract a great deal of attention because it takes a lot of time to do this. If you've ever looked up every occurrence of the word church in the New Testament, you know that when it's over, you've got 112 or so occurrences, but then it's taken you many, many hours to do that. The same with other things. You get down to the point here, and it's tricky, it's time-consuming, it's a very, very complicated thing. But secondly, the general conclusion that I have come to is Mark 16:9 to 20 is certainly in the New Testament. I see no basis for even hesitating there. I do have some caution with Acts 8 and verse 37. I think the contextual argument is extremely strong, and yet the evidence is there only by the context and quotations from early writers. It's a difficult one. In my judgment, the jury is still out. But in 1 John 5 and verse 7, I do not see the basis for it. Now let me quickly say that most of the New Testament is very sure. 1/1000th is the conclusion of Westcott Hort, and I think that's pretty well the case. We do not want to disturb anyone without reason, without ground. This is a technical matter, as you understand. Let us also be careful that we do not close our eyes to evidence that though it may not be exactly what we want it to be when we start, is still the evidence. Well, the passage that I could close with is Matthew 24:35. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. I trust these thoughts have been helpful to you, and I appreciate the invitation. Brother Winkler.